everyone. Welcome back to Sinister Tales. Today's video is going to lean into the darker stuff. We're talking ghost and paranormal horror stories, strange encounters, unexplainable moments, and things people still can't make sense of. If you're into these, like the video, subscribe, and tell me if you want more. All right, let's get into some ghosts and paranormal horror stories. I work for a rural clinic based out of Winford, a small, quiet town tucked into the Blue Ridge. There's a post office, a gas station, and a clinic that does a lot more than anyone gives it credit for. That morning, it was just me, a thermos of terrible coffee, and an aging green Explorer stuffed with blood pressure meds, muscle rub, antibiotics, and 3 heating pads that never stayed put in the back seat. Around 10:00, I hit a roadblock. State plows had dumped a wall of snow where the main road crossed Leonard's Gap, standard practice when they don't want anyone cutting through before they're done. So I took the backup route we use sometimes. Locals call it Millbridge Ridge Road. The road is generous. In places, it's narrow, patched gravel. In others, it's barely more than a frozen rut. It skirts the north side of the ridge and passes a few places that haven't had mailboxes in decades. That's where I saw the truck. A blue Ford, old, boxy, early 80s. Powder blue, rust bleeding along the seams. Hood popped, parked at an angle like it had lost traction, and slid halfway into the ditch. The front tires were still turned, like someone had tried to correct, and then simply stopped trying. Beside it stood a man in white coveralls, like a mechanic would wear. One glove red, the other black. A brown wool cap pulled down over his ears. He wasn't hunched against the cold or stamping his feet. He was just standing there, arms hanging easy at his sides, like he'd been waiting. He didn't wave, didn't step toward me. When I slowed around the bend, he looked straight at me. Not the look of someone stranded. No panic. No please help. Just a slow, quiet stare, like I'd interrupted him mid-thought. I rolled the window down halfway. "Hey," I called. "Everything all right?" He didn't answer. Didn't blink. Expression flat. His skin looked raw, wind-burned maybe, but there was something unnaturally still about him, like a photo posed too perfectly. And then I noticed what made my stomach tighten. He wasn't breathing. I mean, he had to be, but I couldn't see any fog. It was cold, 18 degrees that morning, maybe less in the ridge's shade. And I'd been watching my own breath puff in the windshield light all morning. From him, nothing, just open air. Something twisted hard in my chest. I rolled the window up, put both hands on the wheel, and eased around him without another word. My tires hissed through slush. I didn't look back. I didn't even let myself check the mirror. I drove until I crested the next rise, then pulled over and sat there with the engine ticking. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. It felt like I'd narrowly avoided something awful without knowing what it was. That evening, I told Carly. She's the nurse I usually drive home with, grew up in Winford. Knows all the odd place names no map includes. I expected her to grin, tell me someone was messing with me. She didn't. "You said he wasn't breathing," she said. "No fog. Nothing at all. I'm sure. She stared out the window a moment, then, quietly, I wouldn't take that road again tomorrow, just in case. I almost listened. But the next morning, a patient out near Rutter's Hollow had missed his Friday meds. Blood sugar issues, episodes. Carly didn't want to wait until Monday, and I was the only one free to do the follow-up. The other roads were still iced over. The only way was Millbridge Ridge, so I went. The snow was heavier that day. The air felt heavy too. By the time I reached that bend, I had a knot in my stomach that wouldn't loosen. And there he was, same truck, same spot, same man. Nothing had changed, except this time he moved. As I rounded the bend, he stepped into the road. Slow, stiff. He lifted one arm just enough to flag me down. His face didn't shift at all. That same fixed stare, like he knew exactly when I'd come. I couldn't stop. I barely slowed, hands locked on the wheel, and edged around him as far as I could, riding the shoulder. One tire dropped into slush hard enough to make the Explorer lurch, but I kept going. I didn't breathe until I was well past him. Then I made the mistake of checking the mirror. 100 yards behind me, he was already back beside the truck, facing the same direction, arms at his sides, exactly as before, like he'd never stepped into the road at all. Back at the clinic, I pulled Roger aside, one of the drivers. "Roger, did anyone call in a breakdown?" I asked. He shook his head. "You mean the blue Ford?" My throat went tight. "So you know about it?" Roger leaned back like the answer was obvious. "That one? Hell no, hell no. That truck burned out back in '99. Driver didn't make it. Slid off near the ditch and caught fire." My stomach dropped. "You remember what he was wearing?" I asked. Roger thought. "Coveralls. Gloves too, I think." "Why?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. I kept seeing how slowly the man had raised his arm, like he wasn't asking for help, like he was recording the moment. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him in my headlights, still as a cutout, staring. The next morning, before my shift, I drove the Ridge Road again. I don't know what I expected, proof, closure, anything but that stare. But the bend was empty. No truck, no man, just snow and a few animal tracks crossing the shoulder. I was about to turn back when I saw something dark near the ditch. A single glove, black, half buried, soaked and stiff. I used a plastic bag to pick it up, planning to toss it at my next stop. But when I set it on the passenger seat, it twitched. Just a small movement, fingers curling slightly, like something inside it was adjusting. I pulled over and threw it out the window. I didn't watch it land. I didn't care where it went. That was the last time I ever took no bridge. That winter, I took a caretaker job at a retreat center way out in the Alleghenies, near a place called Ketter's Ridge in West Virginia. Off-season work. Shovel snow, keep fires going, check the cabins for busted pipes or animals moving in. The property had 5 guest cabins, a main hall, a small chapel, and an old barn converted into an equipment shed and backup shelter. There were no guests. A blizzard had sent the last group home early, and nothing was booked until after New Year's. I was alone, snowed in, ringed by trees and silence. For the first couple days, I didn't mind it. The solitude felt clean. On the third night, around 8:00, I went out for my evening check. Snow had been falling all day, thick and steady, and drifts were pushing waist-high in places. I passed the chapel like I always did. It was padlocked and hadn't been opened in weeks. And I stopped dead. Bootprints, one single trail, led straight to the chapel door. They weren't mine. The tread was wrong, and I hadn't been near the chapel all day. Worse, they were pressed into snow that had fallen only an hour or two earlier. The prints walked up to the door and ended. No return trail. Just stopped. I stood there, trying to force an explanation. Delivery, hunter, someone lost. But there were no tire tracks, no other footprints, nothing. I went back to the main hall, grabbed the key, and unlocked the chapel, thinking maybe someone had taken shelter. It wouldn't have been the first time someone underestimated mountain weather. The chapel was empty. Cold benches, a silent iron stove, stale air that hadn't shifted in weeks. I checked the small balcony over the door. I looked behind the pulpit. Nothing. No sound, no movement, just undisturbed cold. Outside, I took a photo of the footprints. When I checked it, the picture was blurry, far blurrier than it should have been. Every other photo I took that night was sharp. That one looked like I'd shot it while walking, even though I'd been still. I blamed numb fingers and kept moving. Weird, sure. Not terrifying. Not yet. 2 mornings later, I woke to the chapel bell ringing. That bell had no rope. It was decorative. The last time anyone rang it in summer, it took 2 people. It wasn't supposed to ring at all. Yet it rang loud and clean across the hill. I bolted outside half-dressed, boots barely on, snow soaking through my socks. By the time I reached the hilltop, it stopped. Not fading, stopping, like someone cut a wire. And there were fragmentos again. This time, the trail started at the barn and ended at the chapel door. Same tread, same size. No return trail. I didn't go inside. I just stood there, heart hammering, watching that door like it might open by itself. Then I backed away and skipped the rest of my rounds. Around 2:00 a.m., I heard footsteps on the bunkhouse porch. The unit I slept in was a single room near the woodpile, just a cot, a stove, and a window that frosted every night. The steps outside were heavy and deliberate, pacing back and forth. No knocking, no handle rattling, just walking like someone waiting. I killed my headlamp and held my breath. Through the frost, I couldn't see much, but the porch told the story. The snow on the boards had been brushed away in a wide path, over and over, by something moving back and forth. I didn't open the door. I grabbed the axe by the stove and waited. Finally, I yanked the door open and stepped out. No one, no wind, no voices, just quiet and the faintest sway of the chapel bell. A low metallic creak, like it had been nudged once, gently. After that, I kept the lights on at night. On the 6th night, I moved into the barn. There was a half-working radio out there, and being close to it didn't make me feel safe. Exactly, just less alone. I laid my sleeping bag in the loft and kept my flashlight against my chest. just after midnight, I heard whispering above me light, high voices, like kids murmuring secrets under a blanket. I shone the flashlight into the rafters and caught only hay dust. Then the light died in my hand. I grabbed my backup. It wouldn't turn on either. I sat in the dark, listening, muscles locked. The whispering continued for maybe 5 minutes, then stopped, not fading, just ending, like a switch flipped. When I finally moved, I saw my boots, ones I'd taken off by the haystack, were gone. They were lined neatly at the barn door, facing out. I didn't sleep again. I stayed up until daylight, hands shaking as I repacked. I didn't care about the job. I didn't care about the snow. I was leaving. That morning, I opened the barn door and froze. Every path I'd shoveled all week was gone, erased smooth, like they'd never existed. The snow looked untouched, but in front of the chapel, a message had been pressed into the snow, not carved, not written, shaped like something had laid its weight into the letters. Stay with us. I didn't even grab my jacket. I walked straight down the ravine through brush and knee-deep drifts, eyes forward, not stopping even when I fell. By mid-afternoon, I reached the road and flagged down a salt truck. The driver didn't ask much, just handed me a blanket and cranked the heat. I spent the rest of that winter at my cousin's place in Charleston. I was driving through a long stretch of Appalachian foothills, somewhere between Silver Creek and a tiny place called Woodmere. Jenna had called a few days before Christmas. She'd been out west for a while, and we hadn't really talked since the funeral. She said she and her boyfriend were heading up early. Come stay a few nights, she told me. We'll cook, hang out, stay warm, bring some wine. The cabin was deep in the hills, where cell service drops out. She texted me a screenshot of an old map and handwritten style directions. She also mentioned a local shortcut, winding and narrow, but faster than taking the highway. I left thinking I'd arrive before dark. It was December 23rd, and about 30 minutes after I turned off the main road, freezing rain started, real slick stuff that glazed the pavement and made every curve feel like a gamble. I figured I could handle it. Decent tires, chains in the trunk, and I'd driven worse. Somewhere along the way, I missed a turn. One curve too many, or I misread a sign. My GPS stopped updating, then began spinning the little arrow in place like it was lost. I pulled over to let it catch up, but it froze. No signal, just trees. Turning around wasn't easy on that narrow road, and I kept telling myself it had to connect back eventually. So I pushed on. The grade steepened. The trees pressed close on both sides. I realized I hadn't seen another car in over an hour. No headlights, no tracks, nothing ahead of me but untouched snow and low fog curling between trunks, heavy enough to cling to the ground. That's when I knew, wrong road. I started hunting for anywhere to turn around. Eventually, I spotted a small gravel pull-off with a wooden trail sign sticking out of the snow. It read Hollow Bend Path in faded letters, and behind it was a narrow gap in the trees. As I slowed to back in, my headlights swept across something to the right. A cabin maybe 30 feet off the road, barely visible through the trees. Dark brown siding, sloped roof. A crooked chimney leaning like the brick had shifted. One shutter hung loose, tapping faintly. It looked abandoned, but not in the normal way. More like it didn't quite belong, like it had been pasted into the woods. The snow on its roof was wrong. Thinner, uneven, not settled like everything else. I didn't dwell on it. I just wanted a signal. I parked, left the engine running, and stepped out with my phone held up like an antenna. Nothing. I took a few steps toward the trees, still nothing. Just that dead quiet you only get in the middle of nowhere, broken by the cooling engine ticking behind me. Then I heard it. Not a voice, not an animal. Something heavy dragging across wood, slow, dry, rhythmic. Chains. I turned toward the cabin. It looked the same, except now smoke rose from the chimney. Thin white smoke, curling straight up like someone had just lit a fire inside. Cold washed through me. I backed to the car without turning my back, got in, locked the doors, and stared out at the trees. My breath fogged the glass. My phone flickered to one bar. I texted Jenna, lost. Stopped near a trail sign. No signal. Trying to turn around. I hit send. It went through. Then something pressed into the back of my car. Not a crash, wait. Like something huge leaned into the trunk. The whole car slid forward a few inches, controlled and deliberate. I couldn't make myself look. I gripped the wheel and turned the key. The engine caught, but the headlights stayed off for a long 3 seconds, long enough to convince me the power had been cut. Then they snapped on, and when they did, the cabin was gone. No roof, no chimney, no smoke, just trees and snow undisturbed, like there had never been anything there at all. I hadn't moved. The car was still in the pull-off, but the view had changed. I backed out hard, tires slipping, and drove like the road might drop away under me. I didn't slow until I saw a gas station's harsh glow about 10 miles down the slope. Inside, an older guy stood at the counter reading. I asked if I was near Hollow Bend Path. He looked up slowly, like I'd said something wrong. Then he nodded once and said the trail had been closed for years. I asked why. A hiker went missing out there one winter, he said. I asked if there had ever been a cabin near the trail. He stared at me for a beat, then said, flat as anything, not anymore. That was it. I didn't go to Jenna's. I didn't even text her. I checked into the first motel I found and sat on the edge of the bed with my coat still on, wide awake. Before sunrise, I drove straight home. I didn't stop for gas until I was an hour from the city. I tried to forget it. On Christmas Eve, an unknown number texted me. No words, just a photo. It showed my car parked in the same pull-off. The snow around it looked untouched, and in the background, through the trees, was the cabin. This time, the photo was taken from inside it. You could see the slats of the broken shutter framing the shot, like whoever took it had toggle watching from behind it. I stared at that image for a full minute. Then I deleted it, blocked the number, and changed my phone plan the next day. New SIM, new number, all of it. I haven't driven through that stretch of mountains since. I was 34 when it happened. The power went out sometime after dark, and I didn't notice right away. The The only reason I caught it was the space heater in the back room cutting off mid-hum. That part of the cabin is always colder, thin insulation. A window that never seals. Since I'd been running the place for my uncle a few months, I'd been using that room for tools, canned food, and supplies. The rest of the cabin runs on wood heat, but the back room needs help. Out here in eastern Kentucky, power drops a few times every winter. You live with it. I assumed a line was down across the ridge. No big deal. I lit the propane lantern near the stove, pulled on my coat and boots, and went out to check the shed generator. Snow was coming down hard, thick, and quiet. The kind that swallows sound. No wind, no rustling branches, no distant road noise. Just a silence so complete you start hearing your own body. Breathing, heartbeat, boots crunching too loud. At the generator, something was immediately wrong. It was dry. Bone dry. I'd filled it 3 days earlier and hadn't touched it since. When I opened the cap, there wasn't even a gas smell, nothing, like it had been siphoned clean. But the snow around the shed was flawless. No tracks, no scuffs, and the cap was resting on the snow beside the unit, not dropped. Placed. I stood there holding the lantern up, trying to make it make sense. I circled the shed, sure I'd find prints somewhere. Nothing but fresh powder and my own tracks leading in. It was strange, but I still didn't leap to anything supernatural. I told myself I must have misremembered filling it. Maybe the cap loosened. Maybe gas evaporated nonsense in that cold. But I was tired and irritated and wanted warmth, not answers. Back inside, I bolted the door. The cabin groaned with the temperature shift, normal for a place built in the late 50s, and repaired 1,000 times since. I built the fire up so the main room would hold heat through the night. Then I decided to move supplies from the back room to keep them from freezing. I started down the hallway and stopped. The air there was much colder than it should have been, freezer cold, fast on the skin. And the back room door was open a few inches. I always keep that door shut. Habit. That room bleeds heat, and the shelf by the window warps if it gets too cold too often. I don't forget it. Still, I wasn't panicking, just unsettled, like something in the house was slightly misaligned. I shut the door, made sure it latched, and moved the food and water into the kitchen. Then I headed up to the loft to sleep. The loft sits above the main room where the heat rises. It's simple. A mattress, shelves, thick blanket, heavy curtain. I fell asleep fast. I don't know how long I slept. No clock up there, and my phone was dead. I just woke in total darkness to a soft scrape below, like something sliding over wood, like a chair moved carefully. I stayed still and listened. It happened again, closer, deliberate. I sat up slowly and leaned over the loft rail. The lantern was off. The fire was low embers. My eyes adjusted, but the corners stayed thick with shadow. Everything looked normal: stove, front door, my boots. Then I saw the hallway. The back room door was open again, that same narrow crack. I stared at it until my mind ran out of excuses. Draft, faulty latch, air currents. Eventually, I climbed down, crossed the room, and shut it again. This time, I shoved a folded rug against the bottom, not for warmth, for proof. I wanted to hear it move. I went back up, and at some point, fell asleep again. When I woke the second time, something felt wrong before I opened my eyes. A thin chill, a stillness like the room was holding its breath. Then I saw snow, not piled, floating, a faint dusting drifting through the air like ash. I held out my hand. Tiny flakes landed and melted. I looked up. The ceiling was intact. No holes, no rot, no explanation. I leaned over the rail. The front door was open wide, snow blowing across the floor. And in the middle of the room, directly below me, stood something. At first it registered as a tall person in a long, dark coat. Then my brain caught up. The shape underneath was wrong, too narrow in places, stretched in others, like it had been pulled into a form that didn't fit. It didn't breathe. It didn't move. It just stood there, perfectly still, snow around it refusing to melt. Then it shifted. It didn't step. It glided, like it floated an inch off the floor. One side dragged behind, as if whatever was inside the coat couldn't move evenly. It drifted to the stove, paused, and turned slightly. I saw what might have been a hand, long and stiff, fingers bent at strange angles like frozen twigs. It crouched beside the stove. The fire dimmed, not out, just smaller, quieter, like it was afraid. I grabbed the closest thing beside the mattress, a small hammer from my tool bag. My hand shook so hard I could barely hold it. The thing rose and began gliding toward the open door. Then it stopped beneath me, dead center of the room, and waited. My legs locked. My lungs burned from not moving. I was sure it knew I was there, but it didn't look up. After a long moment, it turned and slid down the hallway into the back room. The door swung shut behind it. I stayed in the loft until dawn. When I finally climbed down, there was no snow inside, no wet patches, no footprints, only a faint smell of ash, and the back room door was locked from the inside. I didn't touch it. I shoved a cabinet against it, foamed the edges, drove nails into every crack I could reach. That was over a year ago. I sleep on the couch now, and I keep the front door chained. My Uncle Tom ran a small maintenance company up in the hills, around Deering Ridge, one of those half-forgotten Appalachian pockets where city people rent cabins in summer and pretend it's off the grid after the first heavy December snow. He called me. 2 cabins on the outer loop hadn't been checked in weeks, and he didn't want another storm to hit without knowing the pipes were safe. I parked near the main lot and strapped on borrowed snowshoes I didn't fully trust. Snow was 4 feet deep in places. Trees sagged under the weight. The path to the far cabins was just white hills and bare trunks, no landmarks. Cabin 8 was fine. Locked, dry pipes, nothing broken. I did the checklist, took a photo, and kept going. Cabin 11 sat farther off, sunk into a dip where the trees seemed to fold around it. The other cabins had space. This one felt swallowed, like you wouldn't find it unless you already knew it was there. I was uneasy before I reached the steps. The snow around the porch was perfectly smooth, no tracks, no animal prints, Nothing snapped or disturbed, but the door was unlocked, hanging with the latch resting against the frame. That didn't fit. These places were supposed to be sealed in winter. Still, I told myself maybe someone hadn't pulled the handle all the way at the end of last season. Inside was cold and silent. No electricity hum. No creaks. Just stale winter air and that dry smell of wood, dust, and a hint of mildew. Everything looked intact. Windows fine. Pipes unburst. Furniture bland. Tan couch. Plain wood chairs. Ugly green rug. The place looked almost freshly cleaned, which made no sense, but it didn't scream danger. I checked the kitchen and faucets, peeked in closets. One had Monopoly and old puzzles. A dusty Bible sat beside a lamp with no bulb. By the sink were 2 candle holders, wax pooled and hardened like they'd been used once and forgotten. Then I heard the clock. Above the fireplace, a wall clock ticked loud, slow, steady. Tick, tick, tick. That wouldn't have mattered except the back panel was off, and there were no batteries inside. I stepped closer. The hands were moving. I turned it over. Empty. No batteries, no winding key, nothing. My stomach dropped, and I decided I was done. I headed for the door and stopped. A folded sheet of paper sat on the table. It hadn't been there before. I knew the table had been bare, dusty even, but now this paper sat perfectly centered, clean, blank, and untouched. I stood there holding the doorknob, staring at it, feeling like I'd walked into the middle of something that wasn't finished. Then I snapped out of it, went outside, and locked the door. I took another photo for the report, hands shaking more than I wanted to admit. 15 minutes down the trail, I stopped to breathe and looked back. That's when I saw the footprints. There was only one set mine. They went forward to the cabin and back out again. But it wasn't 2 trails. It was one continuous line, like I'd returned in the exact same steps, so perfectly, it looked like I'd never turned around at all. I stared until my eyes watered, trying to convince myself the snow had shifted, that drifting had filled something in. But the snow looked clean and untouched. I turned slowly, scanning the tree line, half expecting to see someone standing there. Nothing. No birds. No sound. Just my boots and distant wind moving through branches. Back at the truck, I radioed my uncle and said the cabins looked good. He reminded me to lock the main gate on the way out. I didn't mention cabin 11, not the ticking, not the paper, not the door, not the footprints. That night I slept hard until around 3:00 a.m. when I woke up freezing. Not normal cold. Teeth chattering, heart thumping cold, like the air had been drained from the room. My heater was blasting. Vents worked, yet I could see my breath. And under it all was a ticking, slow, deliberate, the same rhythm as that clock. I couldn't place where it came from. I turned on lights, searched the apartment twice. I didn't own a clock like that. The sound wasn't in the room. It was in me, like it was tapping from behind my skull. I didn't sleep again. The next day, I called my uncle and tried to sound casual. I asked if anyone had been up to cabin 11 recently, if he'd sent someone before me. He went quiet, then said, That one hasn't been touched in years. He told me they're deep in a family that rented it every winter, same week, every year, until something happened to their youngest son. An accident, he said, though nobody ever got the full story. Afterward, the family demanded their records be wiped. Reservation history erased, pictures removed, everything. They never came back. That evening, I packed a small bag and drove back to the ridge without telling anyone. No gas, no food. The trailhead looked untouched. No tracks, no life. I hiked in, breath fogging, boots sinking deep. When cabin 11 came into view, I stopped cold. A set of footprints already led to the door and back. Same tread as mine. Same stride. Same size. But I hadn't been there yet. The door was locked. I used the master key again, slower than before, braced in a way I couldn't explain. Inside, everything looked the same, except the paper was back on the table. And now it was filled with tiny, faint writing, one sentence, repeated in nearly perfect lines. Don't let him know you saw him. I didn't read further. The ticking stopped. I looked up. The clock was gone, only screws left in the wall. Then the hallway light flickered once, and the back bedroom door, closed when I arrived, creaked open a few inches, slow and gentle, like someone pushing it with one finger. I ran. I slammed the front door, tore through the snow, and didn't stop until I hit the truck. That winter, I left Deering Ridge and slept on my buddy Levi's couch in Oak Burn until I found work downstate. I told my uncle the altitude was messing with my lungs, and I couldn't handle the cold anymore. My cousin Eli took a job in Oregon the year before. Not sure if it would stick. He asked me to keep an eye on his place, $100 a week to check pipes, clear the walkway, fire the stove so the cabin wouldn't freeze, and stay the night now, and then so it didn't look abandoned. I needed the money, and I won't lie, the idea of quiet nights in the woods sounded good. Most weeks were uneventful. I'd bring a book, food, maybe a six-pack, and let the silence settle. No internet. Barely a signal unless you walked 50 yards up the trail. Mostly just stove pops and squirrels on the roof. Then, early December, something changed. I arrived in the afternoon under a heavy, gray sky, the kind that promises more than snow. I hauled extra wood inside, loaded the stove early, heated chowder from a thermos, and read by an old lantern. Around 11:00, the power blinked out. I wasn't using much anyway, but the quiet afterward felt thick and watchful. Even the stove sounded muted. Around 1:00 a.m., something moved past the front window, just a blur, like a person walking quickly with their head down. I wasn't even sure I'd seen it until I was standing. Maybe a neighbor from down the hill checking on things, I told myself. I opened the door and stepped onto the porch. Silence. No voices. No footsteps. Just wind brushing iced trees and a slow drip from the eaves. The porch was slick, so I held the railing and leaned out to see the path. Nothing. No prints in the snow. No tracks at all. I stayed out longer than I meant to, then went back in and locked the door for real. I left the lantern on and kept reading. though I wasn't absorbing anything. Eventually, I lay down on the cot in the back room. Not 20 minutes later, the floor creaked. Not settling, not temperature pops. Slow, intentional creaks, one board at a time, like someone standing near the stove, shifting their weight back and forth. My body went cold and still. I remembered the front door was old and needed a hard twist to catch. I slid my hand under the cot and pulled out a tire iron I'd stashed there. I'd brought it without a reason the first time. It just felt smart. "Hello," I called. "You all right?" Nothing answered. I got up slowly, back to the wall, and edged toward the doorway. Stove glow painted the floor a dull red, enough to see shapes. Nothing moved, but on the boards in front of the stove were small puddles, 5 or 6 of them, concentrated, like someone had stood there dripping from clothes or hair. They hadn't been there earlier, I was sure. I checked the windows shut. No damage. The front door was bolted, thank God. I looked under the table, behind the woodpile. No one. The wet spot stayed. I fed the fire and stayed awake until sunrise with the tire iron across my lap. By morning, the floor was dry. I checked my boots, thinking maybe snow had melted off them without me noticing, but they were bone dry. I told myself that had to be it anyway. The next Friday, I went back. It was 10 degrees colder, the kind of cold you feel through the windshield. The woods looked sharper, harsher, and the whole place felt hollow in a new way. I brought a chunky battery radio, rubber casing, twist dial. It only caught 1 or 2 stations out there, but even static was company. I got settled early, wood stacked, stove hot. The radio buzzed low while I sat on the cot with the same paperback. Around 12:30, I must have dozed off because I woke to a sound that snapped me upright. Click. Not fading, not stuttering. A clean mechanical click, like someone turned the knob off. I sat up groggy and reached for the crate where the radio had been. Gone. Not tipped over, not dead. Gone. I tore through my bag, checked under the cot, under blankets. Nothing. Then I walked into the main room. The puddles were back, and this time they were smaller, barefoot prints, little wet steps starting at the door and moving toward the stove. The trail curved slightly, as if whoever made them turned mid-step toward the wall. Then the prints stopped. The rest of the floor was dry. I stood there staring at the last wet mark when I heard it again. Click, muffled, like it came from underground. I dropped to my knees and pressed an ear to the floorboards. Beneath me, faint static, like the radio was still on somewhere under the cabin. When morning came, I did what I couldn't stop thinking about. I waited for daylight, pulled on gloves, and crawled under the cabin. The ground was frozen everywhere, except one patch near the center, where the dirt was soft and darker, like it had been disturbed recently. I dug with my hands, breaking the soil inch by inch. After 20 minutes, I hit wood. A box about the size of a shoebox, thicker, unmarked, nailed shut. I dragged it out and set it on the porch. I didn't want to open it inside. It took prying, but the lid finally gave. Bones, small ones, fragile ribs, a spine, something like a tiny shoulder blade. Rotting fabric wedged between them, maybe once a blanket. My mouth went dry. I don't remember what I said. Maybe Jesus, maybe nothing. I buried the box again, deeper this time, a couple feet down, and stacked rocks over it like a cairn so it wouldn't shift. That night, nothing happened. No creaks, no puddles, no movement. But the next morning, the radio was sitting on the porch where I'd opened the box. It was on, playing static. The volume knob twitched, like someone was testing how loud it could get before I noticed. I shut it off, pulled the batteries, and left it there. I never went back after that. Eli sold the cabin that spring. The road to the cabin was glazing over by the time I reached Miller's Ridge, usually the halfway mark. I'd made that winter trip 4 years straight, and skipping, it felt like breaking a ritual. The cabin had belonged to my Uncle Heath. When he died, he left it to me because I was the only one who ever cared about the place. Everyone else called it creepy, too far, too cold, no running water. Inconvenient in every way. For me, that was the point. I liked the quiet, especially around the holidays when everything else was noise. Up there, I could breathe. It sits high in the hills, north of a town called Pinter Creek, if you've even heard of it, and hours from anything like a grocery store. No service, no internet, nothing. Just a rusty stove, a sagging porch, and a wood-paneled living room frozen in the 70s. A time capsule, and somehow comforting. I arrived just before sunset. The trees were frosted, and the trail behind my truck was already half covered again. I parked as close as I could, hauled my bags inside, and got the stove roaring. The cabin smelled like wet pine and old ash, musty but familiar. I'd brought a book, coffee, and the same battery radio I used every winter. Before dark fully settled, I went out back to the shed for firewood. That's when I saw the prints. Boot prints, one trail fresh and sharp, coming straight out of the tree line. They led right to the back window. Not past it, not around it, straight to it. And then they stopped. They weren't mine. I hadn't been out there yet, and I hadn't come in through the woods. The tread looked unusual, maybe military. Narrow heel, straight toe. Not a pattern I recognized. And there were no return tracks. No turnaround marks. Just a line from the trees ending at my cabin. I circled the place, checking doors and windows. Nothing broken, nothing ajar, everything locked. Inside, I tried to settle. Soup warmed, fire fed, radio on only static. Sometimes, if the wind was right, it could catch a station out of Canton, but not that night. I gave up and read. Sleep came in pieces. Around midnight, I started hearing soft, repetitive sounds outside near the tree line. Not clear footsteps, more like something being dragged across snow, slow and steady. I sat up and listened. Branches shifting, I told myself. Roof settling, nothing. But it kept happening, just subtle enough to make me doubt my own ears. Around 2:30, the lights flickered and died. The stove went with them. I waited in the dark, listening, then pulled on boots and coat and grabbed a flashlight. Outside air slapped me sharp, dry cold. My breath fogged instantly. Snow crunched like glass. I headed for the generator, then stopped. The boot prints were back. Same tread, same spacing. Only now they didn't end at the window. They circled the cabin, not once, not twice, loop after loop after loop, tight around the walls, crisscrossing in places like whoever made them had been pacing for hours. Outer tracks blurred by wind, inner loops razor sharp and new. I followed them with the flashlight until I lost count. Then I heard the crunch again, close, directly behind me. I spun around, light shaking. Nothing, just more prints curving out of sight. But the crunching continued, faint, steady, like someone was still walking the loop. I didn't check the generator. I went inside, bolted the door, and shoved a dresser against it. I sat on the couch with the flashlight on and waited. I tried turning it off sometimes to save battery, but I didn't sleep. Around 6:00, the power returned. Lights flickered. Stove started humming again. I hadn't touched anything. Leaving wasn't an option. The snow hadn't stopped. My truck was buried to the grill, and the road would have been a nightmare even if I dug out. I stayed inside all day. At lunch, I tried the radio, still static. Late afternoon, restless, I went out back again. Every track was gone, wind and snow had wiped the ground clean. A perfect blank. I might have convinced myself the night was in my head if it weren't for the shed. The shed door was open wide. Not unlatched, open. And that door never moved unless you threw your weight into it. Years of water damage made it stick at the bottom. But there it was, swinging gently, like someone had just stepped out. I didn't go near it. I backed away, went inside, locked up, and stayed still until morning. Before I left, I nailed a note to the inside wall with an old rusty tack. If someone else finds this, don't stay here overnight. Not in the snow. I haven't been back. I live in Fairview now, 3 states south. Different climate, different rhythm. I don't talk about that cabin, not even to my girlfriend. That winter, I took a job watching a cluster of empty cabins in the Greenbrier Hills near Marlow Gap in West Virginia. The owner lived in Georgia. We spoke once on the phone. He wanted someone reliable to stay in cabin 7. Keep snow from piling too badly. Make sure nothing froze or broke. And walk the perimeter after storms to check windows. I was 19, between college semesters, and I didn't want to go home for the holidays. So I said yes. He stocked the pantry, filled the propane tank, and handed me a heavy ring of keys. Every cabin, tool shed, utility room, all of it. Cabin 7 was the largest. 2 stories, slanted roof, wraparound porch that groaned underfoot. A small loft over the living room held a mattress on the floor. The fireplace smoked if the wind hit wrong. Not fancy, but warm enough. The propane generator sat behind a shed about 10 yards away, humming softly, just loud enough to keep the place from feeling completely dead. At night, it kicked on in bursts, like the property was breathing. Cabins 1 through 6 were shuttered and empty. I only had to check them after heavy weather. The first strange thing happened about 2 weeks in after a light storm. I went out with a broom to clear the steps. The snow was only 4 inches, crusted on top. And there were prints. 3 small steps in the snow going up the porch stairs. Not adult boots. not even kid boots. Clean, flat impressions like sneakers. The trail climbed 3 steps, stopped at the porch edge, and vanished. No turnaround, no slide, no jump, just ended. It was early enough that I didn't let myself get scared. I blamed drifting, melting, refreezing, anything. Still, I swept faster than usual. 3 days later, the security unit in the kitchen pinged. Cabin 3 had triggered. Basic system door and window sensors, but reliable. I grabbed the flashlight and keys and walked through the trees. The cabins were spaced, so you couldn't really see one from another through the pines. Outside, cabin 3 looked normal, door shut. No broken glass. Inside, it was warm, not hot livable. The thermostat was set to 62. That's not crazy on its own, except I turned every cabin down to the bare minimum when I arrived. I remember doing it. The owner told me to conserve fuel unless I was actively using one, so someone had turned it up by hand. I lowered it again, searched the rooms. Nothing disturbed, no food, no footprints, no smell of anyone staying. I convinced myself I'd somehow missed this cabin the first time and logged it. 2 days later, I checked cabin 3 again. The thermostat was back at 62. Same number, same faint warmth in the air. That subtle difference between an empty place and one that's been lived in. This time, I called the owner. He swore no one else had keys. No contractors. No scheduled visits. Nothing. I asked if he could be testing remotely. He said the thermostats weren't even on Wi-Fi. Old analog units. That night, I stayed downstairs in cabin 7. Usually I read in the loft. But after that call, the silence felt heavier, like it leaned in. Around 11:00, I heard a sound behind the fireplace, one bounce, like a rubber ball hitting wood. Just one. I held my breath, waited. Nothing else. The next night it happened again, 2 bounces this time. Soft but clear. Deliberate, like someone trying to make sure I noticed. I searched the cabin with a flashlight, closets, corners, under the couch. No ball, no animals, no sign of anything. I stopped sleeping in the loft. After that, I slept on the couch with the fire going and left a kitchen light on. A few mornings later, before sunrise, I was making coffee when I heard the screen door open. It creaked slowly, then shut. Then came 3 or 4 steps across the porch boards, weight shifting, like someone pacing from one side to the other. I stood frozen, hand on the coffee tin, heart pounding. Finally, I flicked on the porch light and opened the front door. Nothing. The cold hit like a wall. The porch snow was smooth as frosting, untouched except for the bottom step. 3 perfect little shoe prints. This time they faced away from the door, like whoever made them had stood there, then walked off. I stayed inside the rest of that day. I didn't clear snow. I didn't go for wood until mid-afternoon. Then, after Christmas, a real blizzard hit. Wind screamed through the trees, visibility collapsed, and I was trapped inside for more than 36 hours. I ran low on split wood and had to trek through waist-high drifts to the covered pile near cabin 4. I bundled up, grabbed a sled, and hauled wood back through a silence that wasn't peaceful, just dense, oppressive. On the way home, I passed cabin 3. The lights were on. Every window glowed warm yellow behind the curtains, steady like someone was inside reading, eating, settled in. I didn't think. I dropped the sled and went straight to the door. I unlocked it, shoved it open, stepped inside, dark, freezing. No heat, no smell of food, no lights. But on the floor lay a mitten, pink wool, child-sized, damp, as if it had been dropped in snow and carried inside before it finished thawing. I didn't touch it. I backed out, locked the door, and dragged the sled back to cabin 7. I tried not to obsess, but my mind kept circling that mitten. Later that night, when I went into the utility room for more wood, I wasn't calm anymore. And there it was, the same mitten lying on top of the wood stack. Same texture, same clumps of snow still stuck to the yarn. I left it. I locked every door, pulled the shades, kept the lights on, and didn't sleep. The last thing happened New Year's morning. A couple inches of fresh snow had fallen overnight. I walked the ridge to check cabins, 1 through 6, one final time. Every single cabin had the same thing, one trail of small, evenly spaced footprints leading to its door. The tracks stopped at the threshold. No damage, no tampering, just a visit. Then I reached cabin 3. This time the prince approached, made a small, slow circle right in front of the door, and stopped exactly where I'd first seen the mitten. That was it. I went back to cabin 7, packed my things, and left the owner a note saying I couldn't finish the job. I didn't want the last week's pay.